Hello, 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 darling students. Hopefully for the last time on YouTube like this. So here's the deal. I'm going to do a brief recap of what we would normally be doing in class if I was there in person, and then I'll be back on Friday so we can actually be a real classroom again. So here's the deal. We're going to start in the end of chapter 4 when it comes to your review questions, and just so you guys know, I am not covering the material in chapter 6 in class. It's a series of stories about how women, Native Americans, Black Americans are all going to deal with the American Revolution. There's not much for me to tell you. It's actually a lot faster for you to read it than it is for me to explain it. So just so you guys know, those are going to be some questions there. So just keep that in mind. Okay, let's dive into the story. So our goal here is the American Revolution. How do we get there? Well, let's start with this first problem. The first problem here is that uh, we got to limit the power of the king, because that's really what the American Revolution's all about, right? We don't like that the king has ultimate authority. But it turns out the United States, whenever we exist, isn't really what starts this process. Turns out the king has been limited before. Let's talk about a brief history of limited monarchy in England. So in 1215, the Magna Carta is written. This is the world's first written constitution, and it gives some limits to the power of the king. The king that has to sign the Magna Carta is the same king from the Robin Hood stories. King John, it's the same king. So that's the one. By the way, the Disney Robin Hood, the animated one, that's the best one. Although, historical side note, the most accurate telling of the Robin Hood story is actually the 1980s comedy Robin Hood Men in Tights. I read a book about that in college. Anyway, next, in 1265 is the formation of Parliament. Parliament at that time was a series of rich nobles that paid taxes, so they kept the king in check because they were the one paying taxes. Then in 1628, we have the Petition of Right, which says that only Parliament can put a tax on citizens. It also established this idea known as habeas corpus, which means you have to be told why you were arrested. This is actually going to become a very fundamental right in the US Bill of Rights. This is where we take it from. The idea being that if the government arrests you, they have to tell you why. And if they don't tell you within 24 hours, you're allowed to walk free, which is why whenever my wife watches NCIS and they have someone or whatever in lockup, there's always like this, oh no, we have to let him go by 2 o'clock or whatever. That's always like the plot device. Now you know why. The 1628 Petition of Right. Okay, so in the before times, i.e., what I expected we would do this week, we'd actually be reading this document known as the English Bill of Rights. But since we're not going to have time to read this in class, I'll just tell you about it instead. So the English Bill of Rights is this document that is written in the 1600s, and the idea here is that the British citizens are really upset with the king. The king has issued a series of taxes. The king has kept a standing army during peacetime. The king has limited free speech. The king has made it so that way certain groups of people could not be armed. The king has done all of these things. And this happens in England. The colonies aren't mentioned at all in this document. But what ends up happening here is that the British citizens are going to demand better protections from the English king. Now, the British citizens are going to get those rights from the English king in the English Bill of Rights. So why does that matter for the colonies if the colonies aren't mentioned in the document? Well, the thing is, the rights that come from the English Bill of Rights are some of the greatest ever given to any people in the world. It was said during this time period that it was an honor and a privilege to live under the British monarchy, under the English Bill of Rights. The average citizen was treated pretty well. In fact, up until the United States is created with the US Constitution and US Bill of Rights, these are basically the best rights any citizens in the world ever have. So, again, why does that matter to the American colonists? There's one really simple reason. The American colonists assume that they have access to the British Bill of Rights. For example, some of the things in these Bill of Rights says that there is The king can't apply a tax unless the parliament agrees to it. Does that sound like a quote you probably heard about American history before? Um, there are things in here about property being taken away and people being arrested. Again, pretend you have some vague recollections of 8th grade. I know it's been a while, and that was probably when the COVID shutdown happened for you guys, but you probably heard something about a series of taxes and a series of events that happened in America where the Americans are so upset. But has anyone ever told you why they're upset? They're upset because the Americans feel that their English Bill of Rights, their rights as citizens in the British Empire, have been taken away from them unfairly. Sorry, had a coughing fit. So now that we know that, let's go ahead and tell the story and see where this all comes from. The year is now 1754, and the American Revolution is about to begin in earnest. Okay, let's figure out why it happens. Hold on, I'm gonna have a cough attack. Okay, I'm back with a cough drop. I'll be able to make it through the rest of this lecture, I hope. Let's dive in and tell the story. Now, here's the thing. The other weird thing, as I set up this story, the year is 1754 in the British North American colonies. And the British North American colonies, right now, like if you could go back in time and you're going to live in the British Empire, living in North America 1753, 1754 is a really good time to be living in North America. The British North American colonists are super cool being British. They have, they think, the protection of the English Bill of Rights. The colonies are prosperous, taxes are low, things are pretty good. If you can go back to a time and you had to be a British, a British citizen at some point in like world history, 1753, like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, not a bad time to be. Okay, everything is fine, everything is awesome, and then a war breaks out. But why? Well, it turns out Great Britain and France are going to fight over the land in the American colonies. As you guys should remember, the French have essentially settled in the Quebec, northern Illinois area of the North American Empire, that whole Canada place. And the British, of course, have the American 13 colonies. Well, the next area to fill in the map is going to be this area known as the Ohio Valley. Now, I know you guys probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about Ohio, but it turns out Ohio is probably one of the most valuable places in the world at this time period. In fact, did you know Ohio has produced more presidents and astronauts than any other US state? Which means Ohio is so crappy that you want to leave the planet rather than stay there or run the country. Anyway, why is Ohio so valuable? Well, there's good farmland there, and pretty much every American at this time period is a farmer. So this land is going to be seen as very valuable. In fact, one of these early Americans at this time period, his name is George Washington. He's going to try to get huge tracts of land in this region. In fact, that's part of how he becomes so wealthy. Actually, he also marries like the wealthiest widow in the area and then takes all of her family's land. Anyway, that's the way to do it. Now, Great Britain and France, my wife's sitting next to me upset. Great Britain and France are basically going to have a little bit of a kerfuffle over this land. There's going to be a fight that breaks out over this land. Now, the British North American colonies really have nothing to do with this. Think of this almost as like, Great Britain is dad and France is mom, and they're having a fight, and we're kind of just stuck in the middle of it, right? So this dude, he gets together and he calls for something called the Albany Congress. And his name is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's going to get a group of the colonists together and goes, hey guys, it looks like the two biggest empires in the world are about to fight each other, and they're probably going to fight here. Maybe we should protect ourselves, right? I don't know, think of it this way, like your parents are fighting and you siblings kind of agree to protect each other. That's what the Albany Congress is all about. He writes a document, it's called the Albany Plan of Union, where he says, hey, let's agree to protect each other when mom and dad start fighting, because we all know they're gonna. Let's protect ourselves. Well, the only reason why you ever have to know about this is one, there's that famous political cartoon in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Perhaps you've seen it. Ben Franklin draws it, and the implication being that if the American colonies don't unite to protect themselves, they're going to be destroyed by the British and the French in this upcoming war. And as you can tell, I have a join or die t-shirt, and that is me standing in front of Buckingham Palace. It's also my honeymoon. So if your question is, did I wear pro-America shirts on my honeymoon in Europe? The answer is yes. And my wife is very forgiving and supportive of her very strange husband. Anyway, okay, let's recap, because this is what students get this confused a lot. The American Revolution hasn't really started yet. Instead, Ben Franklin just realizes, hey, there's going to be a fight, and the fight's probably going to take place in North America. Shouldn't us colonies agree to protect each other when that fight happens? I mean, that makes logical sense, right? The colonies don't agree. They don't want to agitate the British. Again, 1754, everything is cool in British North America. Let's not upset mom and dad. Let's have them just not even notice us. That's probably the better thing. We've been doing that for a while. Great Britain's kind of not noticed us, and things have been good. Let's not do anything that's going to make them notice us, even if mom and dad are about to fight. Okay, moving on. Oh, look, here's a map of the territory. That way you can kind of see what's going to happen here. You can see the French territory in blue, and you can see the British territory in red. They're going to be fighting over the Ohio Valley, which is basically empty, especially if you don't consider the Native Americans, which of course the British won't. Anyway, let's talk about the ultimate kerfuffle that is going to break out. It's called the French and Indian War. Now you're gonna make me cough. Okay, it's called the French and Indian War. In Great Britain, I believe they call this King Philip's War. But here in North America, we call this the French and Indian War. So what goes down here? Well, that big fight that Ben Franklin warned everybody about, that big fight over the Ohio Valley that is like obviously going to break out and happen, it happens. The British and the French are going to fight each other over this land in the Ohio Valley. Now, technically, even though this is happening around the American colonies aren't part of this story. It may be why you've never really heard it emphasized this much before, but I'm going to because I know what's going to happen next. Okay, so a big fight's going to break out between the British and French over the Ohio Valley. The American colonists aren't really involved. However, obviously, the American colonists have a lot to gain from this war, right? Like, if the British win, the American colonists get a bunch more land. That's going to make them really rich. So, like, even though the Americans aren't directly involved in this conflict, they still want Britain to win, right? Who wouldn't? Now, logically, if the British and French are going to fight a war, wouldn't it make sense if the British use a really big asset, the thing that makes the British colonies the most powerful and successful in this region? You know, the fact that they had actually colonized and settled, there are like millions-ish of people living here. So, okay, if a war is going to break out, the British need soldiers, right? Now, the British do have the largest army and navy in the world. Sure, the British could ship all of their soldiers overseas, land them in the American colonies, have them march across the American colonies, go up and over the Appalachian Mountains, and then fight the French army that would presumably be in the Ohio Valley, right? That could happen. And in some cases that does, but like that's a needless expense, right? There's this dude, his name is William Pitt. He's like the head commander of the British Army. And he says, hey, here's a thought. Rather than transporting all of those troops over the ocean, across the colonies and into Ohio, what if we just have the colonists go into Ohio themselves. Like, let's just make them be the army. Why bring the army here? We got plenty of people. Let's just have the American colonists do it. Okay. And here is the promise that he makes to the American colonists. I want you guys to put 5 stars next to this. As soon as I say this sentence to you, 1, it's going to blow your mind, and 2, all of 8th grade is going to make sense to you. I know that's quite a shock to have someone say that. The awkwardness of 8th grade is suddenly going to have meaning and purpose. In fact, it's going to be very strange once I tell you what this is that you've never heard of it before, because it makes the entire next part of the story all fit. This is the puzzle piece that, like, you've never been taught that explains why America exists. Are you ready? I promise I'm not overselling it. My wife is sitting right next to me working on stuff for her class, so we'll see if she's surprised by this statement too. I'm not even sure if she's heard of this. You ready? Okay, my dog is ready too. So, what is Pitt's promise? Pitt promised the American colonists that if they fight in this war on behalf of Britain, they will not have to pay for it. I will pause while you pick up your brain off the floor because your mind has just been blown. You know that phrase, no taxation without representation? Why are the Americans so upset about a tax? That's never explained to you, right? When you're in 8th grade, the story is, oh, taxes must just suck in general, so that's why the Americans are upset. No, they're not. That's not why. It's not just because taxes stink and everyone hates paying them. Of course that's the case. But the thing is, there's a reason why the Americans are so upset about these specific taxes. It's because they were promised if they fight in this war, and they do, they're promised that they would never have to pay any taxes for it. But of course, immediately after this war is over, the British need to raise money, and they start issuing all of these taxes on the American colonists. That's why they're so upset. If the British would have kept Pitt's promise and never taxed the American colonies, we'd all be British right now. We'd all be sipping tea and eating crumpets and, like, discussing the Queen and, like, her handbags and corgis. Like, that's what we'd be doing right now. We'd all have terrible teeth. It would be awful. We'd all be British if Pitt's promise was kept. But obviously it's not. That's where America really comes from. And now you know. Okay, so side note, the actual war happens and the British win, obviously. The British win, and they take over the Ohio Valley. The Treaty of Paris basically says that the French are going to essentially leave North America. They keep a little bit of territory around this area known as New Orleans that will become important later, but in general, the French basically bail. And that means now that the American colonies and the British essentially have control of North America all the way to the Mississippi River, which is about as far as any European has gone by this point. It's a huge swath of territory, and now it is rife for the taking by the British North American colonists. This is exciting times in the American colonies. It's exciting times for Britain. Everybody is happy until the bill comes due for the war. Okay. I hope you guys are all following along with what happened here. If not, replay this slide. Moving on. Now, immediately after this war, obviously, the Americans want to settle in this land. Like, the war is over. Now let's go get all the land that we just fought for, right? Let's go settle all of this land. So the American colonists, like that dude named George Washington and others, are going to spill over into the Ohio Valley and try to claim as much land as they can to have massive farms. Remember, when everyone's a farmer, the only way to make more money is to have a bigger farm. This is the best opportunity we're ever going to have giant farms to make money. So the American colonists want to spill over into this region. The problem is, as they spill over into this region, it turns out it wasn't empty after all. Hey, remember those Native Americans that we said, yo, guys, go ahead and just move west. We'll take the land near the coast, and you guys go ahead and move west, and then everything will be cool? Well, where do you think they moved west to? They moved from the coastal areas up and over the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley. There's a bunch of Native Americans there. And when these American colonists come and like, okay, we're going to take this land too, obviously they're going to be a little upset. And the Native Americans start slaughtering all of the North Americans that they find. They're not super happy with their land being invaded again after they were promised that it never would. Now, as the Americans are getting slaughtered, they turn to the king and go, yo, king, you're supposed to be protecting us, bro, and now we're getting slaughtered here. So the king does something that is very unpopular. It makes sense from the king's perspective why he would do this, but it's very unpopular to the American colonists. The king issues something called the Proclamation of 1763, where the king says, hey, colonists, you can't enter the Ohio Valley. Like, rather than opening up the Ohio Valley all at once, the king says, look, I'm going to block off the entire Ohio Valley. You can't cross over the Appalachian Mountains. And instead, what the king plans to do is like, hey, let's open up one tract of land a little at a time. That way I can just move the army in there a little bit, keep everyone safe, we'll settle that territory, then we'll move 50 miles and we'll open up another territory. From the king's perspective, it makes it a lot easier to control and protect this region. But the American colonists are not happy with this because they want to get as much land as possible. They don't want to wait for it to be safe. They want to go in there right away and get as much land. So this quote that I have here is from a historian that basically says this is the exact problem. The proclamation line is impossible for the king to enforce, and it really only angered the colonists. The colonists want this land, and they don't want to enter it slowly and safely and do things like, conservatively. Nuts to that, we want the spoils of war. We want to get rich now. So the Americans are already relatively agitated at the king because of this proclamation line. They're not super happy that they can't go and get rich. And now, let's preview a problem, and then I'll spend more time on Friday and next week going into more detail about the specifics. But again, you can probably see what's going to be happening next year because you guys made it through 8th grade. All right. It's 1763 and the bill has come due from this war. Hey, this war was really expensive and the bill's coming due. Now, the British citizens are not super happy when this bill comes due because they're actually already, the people in London and England itself, they're some of the most heavily taxed people in the world. Historical side note, the American colonists are some of the lowest taxed people in the world. Anyway, so the British citizens are like, all right, well, guess what? We're not paying for this. Why don't you let the Americans pay for this? In fact, the American colonists got rich off of the French and Indian War. The British monarchy spent a bunch of money building up the American colonies to be able to fight this war. The American colonists get rich off of this. And remember their promise that they won't have to pay for it. And the American colonists should have access to millions of square miles of arable land. This is a great deal for the American colonists. And the British citizens are like, wait, we got to pay more in taxes for other people to get rich? You can see how there's going to be a bit of a kerfuffle and a disagreement between the American colonists and the British citizens. Now, to foreshadow the story, a series of revenue-gaining acts are going to be passed. We'll talk about them tomorrow, but I'm sure you know what they are, like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, all that kind of stuff. These acts get passed, and the Americans go, hey, no taxation without representation, bro. the only thing from 8th grade you probably remember. Parliament responds with, well, okay, you're right. There is no American colonist in Parliament, but you guys have virtual representation, which means that us parliamentarians, we really care about every citizen in the empire. So you're right, you don't have a representative on our council, but we still care about you. Doesn't that sound hollow? That's what the Americans say. It's like, well, wait a minute. Okay, that sounds great. You're supposed to care about me, but like, the whole idea like representation matters and stuff like that, and it's important to show multiple perspectives on things. Well, the British basically say, yeah, you're right. Representation does matter, and we represent you. No, you don't. You're a bunch of like, people that have never come to North America. How could you possibly represent a bunch of American farmers when you've never farmed a day in your life and you're some British aristocrat that's 4,000 miles away? Plus, you're lying to us. You promise that you're never going to tax us, but you do anyway. That's what no taxation without representation really means. Now, as I'm sure you can guess, and as we'll talk about in more detail starting tomorrow, when the British pass a bunch of laws, and we'll talk about specifics tomorrow, the Americans are going to break them. For example, if you're going to put a tax on sugar, well, I'm just going to go ahead and steal some sugar. Or the fancy S word here, it's called smuggling. Smuggling is basically when you break a law. Now, not to get too technical, but what would happen here is that the British would pass a law saying that there's a tax on sugar and you have to buy British sugar. So what the Americans would do is we would just go buy like Spanish sugar or Brazilian sugar and not pay that British tax. We just buy it from someone else. And we obtain sugar illegally. Or we obtain tea illegally. Or we obtain paper illegally. Again, all those vague memories you have from 8th grade, we're just going to break the law. In fact, some of the most famous Americans that you've probably heard of from this time period, like this dude named John Hancock and Sam Adams, they are famous for smuggling goods and breaking the law. That's how they get rich. Some of the richest American families of this time period get rich breaking the law intentionally. So, the British passed something called the Writs of Assistance, which basically means that the British have the ability to search any colonist house for illegally smuggled goods. They can just knock on your door, walk in, and go ahead and like, I don't know, check your phone and look at your text messages and your search history without any sort of privacy on your part, even if you've done nothing wrong. It's a huge invasion of privacy, right? Can you imagine if Mr. Ritchie walked in right now and just like took all of your phones and went ahead and went through all of your like, I don't know, what apps do you guys use now? They went through all of your TikToks or they went through all of your stuff. You'd probably feel very offended by that, especially if you didn't do anything wrong. Well, that's how the Americans feel. That being said, most Americans are breaking the law. So maybe they deserve this, but hmm. Again, this is all foreshadowing for the problems that we're going to be talking about tomorrow. Okay, last thing and then we're done. Tensions are rising very high in America, in the American colonies during this time period. We have the American colonists who are upset that any tax would ever be imposed on them because it's a violation of Pitt's promise. And on the other hand, we have the British citizens in London and stuff like that are upset that they have to pay the highest taxes in the world while the Americans are getting rich. The people in the British Empire are not super happy with each other. Now, this is a difficult political situation to handle. Normally, in this kind of a situation, you would want like, a very level-headed and experienced politician that could make all of these disparate groups agree to disagree and solve all these world problems. Instead, the British king is this dude named King George III, perhaps one of the biggest morons in the history of the world. And I don't just say that as an American, I say this as someone who is like studying world history. The guy becomes king really young, and I'm going to use a fancy word for you, he's very petulant. The idea being that he won't listen to advisors and he thinks he knows more than everyone else. And like, because he's king, everyone's afraid to tell him he's wrong. So he makes bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, makes everybody upset, and like nearly destroys the entire British Empire while he is king. Which is why it's so strange that you can see his giant portrait everywhere. You guys can see me in the bottom left there. Again, my lovely wife being so patient with me. Every time we saw a picture of King George III when we were in Europe, I had to give a thumbs down to. There's actually three distinct paintings, these 20-foot tall paintings. There's three of them that we saw over the course of 2 days. So of course I had to give the thumbs down each time I saw it. Um, the tour group that we were part of, most of the people were European, not American, and they didn't understand what I was doing, but I did it anyway. And then we went on a walk in London and found a statue of King George III, so of course I had to give the thumbs down to that too. Again, the people around had no idea why I was doing this, but I felt good about myself, and that's all that matters. Anyway, here's the point. When the world is falling apart, you want to have capable leaders to like mitigate the damage. Well, the world is falling apart around not just the American colonies, but also in London. And the dude that's responsible for fixing all of this stuff and making it okay is like one of the worst possible leaders the world could possibly have. As everything falls apart, we can kind of look back at King George and say, you know, bro, this might be your fault. That's where the story is going to stop for today. Tomorrow in class, we will pick up on some of the particulars. We'll look at some of the specific acts. We'll talk about some more of them next week. And then we'll move on into the reason why the Americans are so upset and how we explain and display our anger. All right, I'll see you guys soon. Bye.